Some things you never forget. The weight of a leather collar around your neck, the sound of your family's laughter as they watch you kneel, the moment you realize that blood doesn't always mean love. Christmas Eve, 2023, was supposed to be magical. The Sterling mansion on Maple Avenue gleamed with thousands of twinkling lights, each window framed with garland that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Inside, the 20-foot Fraser fir dominated the living room, its branches heavy with ornaments that sparkled like captured stars. The house smelled of pine, cinnamon, and money. I stood in the corner with my children, watching the gift exchange unfold like a carefully choreographed performance. Madison, my younger sister, squealed with delight as she unwrapped her third designer handbag of the evening. A Hermes Birkin, if the gasps from our gathered relatives were any indication. At 25, Madison had never worked a day in her life, yet somehow managed to accumulate more luxury goods than most people see in a lifetime. "Oh, Daddy, it's perfect," Madison cooed, throwing her arms around Richard Sterling's neck. Our father beamed with pride, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, his cashmere sweater probably costing more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. "Only the best for my princess," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Eleanor, our mother, watched from her throne-like chair near the fireplace. Even at 58, she was undeniably beautiful, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, her red dress hugging curves that spoke of personal trainers and expensive spa treatments. But her eyes, those ice-blue eyes that had once looked at me with something resembling love, now held only disgust. "Nadia," she called, her voice cutting through the festive chatter like a blade. "Come here." My stomach clenched. I glanced down at my 7-year-old daughter Chloe and 5-year-old son Ethan, both clutching the small gifts I'd managed to scrape together for them. Hand-knitted scarves and books from the used bookstore. They looked so small in this vast room, so out of place among the designer clothes and expensive gifts. "Go on, Mommy," Chloe whispered, her green eyes wide with nervous anticipation. She still believed in the magic of Christmas, still thought that maybe this year would be different. I walked across the Persian rug, my second-hand dress feeling shabby among the silk and cashmere that surrounded me. Every eye in the room followed my movement. Cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends, they all knew the score. I was the family disappointment, the cautionary tale, the daughter who had fallen from grace and could never climb back up. "Yes, Mother?" I kept my voice steady, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. Eleanor's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "We have something special for you this year. Richard, would you get the box?" My father moved to the massive tree and retrieved a medium-sized box wrapped in silver paper with an elaborate bow. He handed it to Eleanor with a flourish, and I noticed Madison pulling out her phone, angling it for the perfect shot. "This is for you, darling," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "A reminder of your place in this family." The room fell silent except for the soft crackling of the fire. I unwrapped the box with trembling fingers, my children pressing closer to me, their innocent excitement palpable. Inside, nestled in tissue paper like a precious jewel, was a dog collar. Not just any dog collar, but an expensive leather one with silver studs and a nameplate that read "worthless" in elegant script. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then, Madison's delighted giggle shattered the quiet. "Oh my God, that's perfect," she squealed, still recording. "Put it on, Nadia. It'll look so cute on you." Richard stepped forward, his face wearing that cold smile I'd learned to fear as a child. "Go on, sweetheart. Let us help you with that." Before I could protest, he was behind me, his hands rough as they grabbed my hair and forced me to my knees. The Persian rug scratched against my skin through my thin dress. Chloe screamed, a high, piercing sound that cut through me like a knife. Ethan started to cry, those big, heartbroken sobs that only children can produce. Eleanor rose from her chair with the grace of a queen and the smile of a predator. She took the collar from the box, her manicured fingers caressing the leather like it was made of spun gold. "This is what happens to ungrateful daughters," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "This is what happens to failures." The leather was cold against my throat as she fastened it, tight enough that I had to fight for each breath. The silver studs pressed into my skin, and I could feel the nameplate heavy against my collarbone. Around us, the family watched in stunned silence. Some looked uncomfortable, others amused. A few pulled out their phones. "There," Eleanor said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Much better. You look exactly like what you are." Madison lowered her phone, her face flushed with excitement. "I'm totally posting this. Everyone needs to see what a loser looks like," she typed rapidly, her fingers flying over the screen. Within seconds, I knew my humiliation would be broadcast to her thousands of followers. I knelt there on the expensive rug, surrounded by the glittering opulence of my childhood home, wearing a dog collar like some kind of perverted Christmas ornament. My children sobbed behind me, and I could feel their confusion and pain as if it were my own. But in that moment, as I knelt there with leather tight around my throat and my mother's laughter ringing in my ears, something fundamental shifted inside me. The last piece of the little girl who had once loved these people, who had once desperately sought their approval, finally died. In its place, something harder and infinitely more dangerous was born. I looked up at Eleanor, meeting her gaze directly for the first time in years. "This will be the last time," I whispered, my voice so quiet that only she could hear. Her smile faltered for just a moment, something flickering behind those ice-blue eyes. Then she laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Oh, darling, you'll never be anything more than this. Accept it." I reached up and unfastened the collar with steady hands, letting it drop to the floor between us. The sound it made hitting the hardwood seemed to echo through the sudden silence. I stood, brushing off my knees, and turned to my children. "Come on, babies," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in years. "We're going home." As we walked toward the door, Richard called after us. "Don't you dare leave, we're not finished with you." I turned back one last time, looking at the 3 people who had given me life and spent the last 30 years trying to destroy it. "Actually," I said, my hand on the doorknob, "we are finished, completely." The drive home was quiet, except for Chloe's occasional sniffles. Our apartment was a tiny 2-bedroom in a complex that had seen better days, but as we pulled into the parking lot, it felt like a palace. It was ours. It was safe. It was free from the poison that filled that beautiful house on Maple Avenue. That night, after I tucked my children into bed and assured them that we would never go back to Grandma and Grandpa's house, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a notebook. The collar sat in front of me, the silver nameplate catching the overhead light. I picked it up, running my fingers over the expensive leather, feeling the weight of all the humiliation it represented. Then I opened the notebook and began to write. Not a letter, not a diary entry, but a plan. A careful, methodical, devastating plan. The next morning brought a flurry of notifications on my phone. Madison had indeed posted the video, and it was spreading across social media like wildfire. The comments were a mix of outrage and mockery, but what surprised me was how many people were defending me. Strangers who didn't know my story but recognized cruelty when they saw it. I screenshotted everything, every comment, every share, every reaction. Evidence, documentation. The first pieces of what would become my arsenal. Over the next 3 months, I became a different person. The old Nadia, the one who had spent 30 years begging for scraps of love from people incapable of giving it, was gone. In her place stood someone harder, smarter, more focused. I cut my long brown hair into a sleek bob and started hitting the gym at 5 a.m. every morning. I picked up a second job waitressing at Romano's, the upscale Italian restaurant downtown where the city's elite like to be seen. It was there that I overheard Richard talking to Thomas Whitmore, the city planning commissioner, about a development deal. Something about forcing residents out of the Riverside neighborhood to make way for luxury condos. I kept my head down and my ears open, memorizing every detail. I also enrolled in a paralegal program at the community college, using the money I'd been saving for Chloe and Ethan's Christmas presents. The legal classes were eye-opening. I learned about evidence collection, about recording laws, about how to build a case. I learned that what my family had done to me wasn't just cruel, it was potentially actionable. I started visiting Riverside regularly, talking to the longtime residents who were being pressured to sell. Mrs. Rodriguez had lived in her house for 40 years and was being threatened with eminent domain. Mr. Chen's family restaurant was facing health code violations that seemed to appear only after he refused to sell. The pattern was clear, and Richard's fingerprints were all over it. That's when I learned about the annual Winter Charity Gala, the Sterling family's crown jewel event. Every February, they hosted the city's most prominent citizens at their home to raise money for underprivileged children. The irony wasn't lost on me. This year's gala would be bigger than ever. Eleanor had been elected president of the Evergreen Hills Women's Club, and she was using the position to host the event. The guest list read like a who's who of the city. Mayor Davidson, Judge Patricia Holbrook, Police Chief Martinez, and dozens of business leaders and socialites. The hardest part was getting an invitation. Working at Romano's had its advantages. I had served many of the gala attendees, and I had learned that Patricia Holbrook was a regular who always sat alone and always looked lonely. Judge Holbrook was a formidable woman in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with a reputation for fairness that had earned her respect across party lines. It took 3 weeks of careful conversation during her weekly dinners at Romano's before I worked up the courage to mention the gala. I told her I was interested in charity work but couldn't afford the entrance fee. She studied me for a long moment with those piercing gray eyes, then surprised me by offering to sponsor my attendance. "I could use some company," she said simply. "And you strike me as someone who has things to say." She had no idea how right she was. February 14th arrived gray and cold, with the promise of snow in the air. I spent the morning at the salon, using money I couldn't afford to get my hair and makeup done professionally. The woman who looked back at me from the mirror was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the tired, defeated daughter who had knelt on that Persian rug. In her place was someone who looked like she belonged in the Sterling mansion. My dress was simple but elegant, a black cocktail dress I'd found at a consignment shop. It wasn't designer, but it fit perfectly and made me look like exactly what I was, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Judge Holbrook picked me up at 6, her silver Mercedes purring through the expensive neighborhoods until we reached Maple Avenue. The Sterling mansion blazed with lights, every window glowing warmly against the February evening. We entered through the same front door I had fled through 3 months earlier, but this time I walked with my head high and my shoulders back. The great room had been transformed into a ballroom, with round tables set for 10 and a small stage at the far end. Ice sculptures shaped like swans graced the buffet tables, and servers in black tie moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Eleanor stood near the entrance in a stunning red gown, greeting guests with the grace of a practiced hostess. She saw me before I saw her, and I watched her face go through a series of rapid changes. Surprise, anger, confusion, and finally a cold calculation. "Patricia, how lovely to see you," she said to Judge Holbrook, her voice warm honey over broken glass. Then her eyes moved to me, and the temperature dropped noticeably. "Nadia, what an unexpected surprise." "Eleanor," I replied smoothly. "Thank you for having such a beautiful event. The decorations are exquisite." Judge Holbrook watched the exchange with sharp eyes, and I could see her beginning to piece together the dynamics at play. Dinner was an elaborate affair of multiple courses and expensive wines. I sat at Judge Holbrook's table, surrounded by lawyers and city officials, listening to their conversations while keeping one eye on the Sterling family table. Richard looked distinguished in his black tuxedo, playing the role of successful businessman and devoted father. Madison was in her element, flirting with the young men at neighboring tables and posing for photos whenever a camera pointed her way. As the servers cleared the dessert plates, Eleanor stood and moved to the small stage. The room gradually quieted as she took the microphone, her red dress making her look like a flame against the dark backdrop. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "thank you all for being here tonight. Your generosity will make a real difference in the lives of underprivileged children throughout our community." Applause rippled through the room. Eleanor waited for it to die down before continuing. "As many of you know, family has always been the cornerstone of my life. My husband Richard and I have been blessed with 2 wonderful daughters, and we've tried to instill in them the values of compassion, generosity, and love for others." She gestured toward Madison, who stood and gave a little wave. I noticed she didn't mention that she had a granddaughter and grandson sitting at home with a babysitter, children she had never once acknowledged in public. Tonight's proceeds will go directly to the Children's Haven Foundation, which provides food, clothing, and educational support to families in need. Because no child should ever go without the basic necessities of life. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. Eleanor continued her speech, painting herself as a devoted mother and grandmother, a pillar of the community who had dedicated her life to helping others. Finally, she finished to thunderous applause. As she started to leave the stage, I stood. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying across the room. "I'd like to say something." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to me, including Eleanor's. She stood frozen at the edge of the stage, her face a mask of polite confusion. "It's exactly the time," I interrupted, walking toward the stage. Judge Holbrook rose beside me, her hand resting on my arm in a gesture of support. "You see, I have a story about family values that I think everyone here would find very interesting." I reached the stage and held out my hand for the microphone. Eleanor's eyes darted around the room, looking for help, for escape, for anything. But she was trapped by the very social conventions she had spent her life manipulating. She gave me the microphone with hands that trembled slightly, then stepped back. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady and clear. "My name is Nadia Sterling. I'm Eleanor's daughter." A murmur ran through the crowd. Many of them knew the Sterlings had 2 daughters, but I had been absent from public events for so long that some of the newer residents had never seen me. 3 months ago, on Christmas Eve, I sat right here in this house with my 2 children, ages 7 and 5. My mother and father had invited us to join the family celebration, and my children were so excited. They thought maybe this year would be different. Maybe this year, their grandparents would finally show them some love. I paused, letting my eyes move across the room. I could see Eleanor in my peripheral vision, her face white as paper. Richard had half risen from his chair, his mouth open in shock. Instead, my parents gave me a gift. A leather dog collar with my name engraved on it. Not my real name, of course. The nameplate read "Worthless." Gasps echoed through the room. Someone dropped a glass, the sound sharp and final in the stunned silence. My father forced me to my knees in front of my children and our extended family. My mother fastened the collar around my neck while my 7-year-old daughter screamed and my 5-year-old son cried. My sister Madison filmed it all and posted it on social media for her entertainment. I reached into my small clutch and pulled out my phone. With a few quick taps, I connected it to the house's Bluetooth system. The large screens around the room, meant to display the charity's promotional materials, suddenly showed Madison's Instagram post from Christmas Eve. The video was even worse than I remembered. The sound of Chloe's screams filled the room as the audience watched Eleanor fasten the collar around my neck. They heard Richard's cruel laughter, Madison's delighted commentary, and my children's heartbroken sobs. When it ended, the silence was deafening. "This," I said, gesturing to the frozen image on the screens, "is what family values look like in the Sterling household. This is the love and compassion you just heard so much about." Eleanor finally found her voice. "Those images were taken out of context," she cried, rushing toward the stage. "She's lying. She's always been jealous, always been troubled." But I wasn't finished. I tapped my phone again, and the screens filled with a new image. Bank records showing large donations from Richard's company to the Children's Haven Foundation, followed immediately by equal withdrawals. The money had never actually been given to charity. "These are the charitable donations my father has been claiming for the past 5 years," I said. "As you can see, the money goes out and comes right back in. The Children's Haven Foundation exists only on paper. Not one penny has ever reached an actual child in need." The room erupted. Voices rose in anger and confusion. Several people pulled out their phones, some calling lawyers, others already posting to social media. The next image showed screenshots of text messages between Madison and her friends, planning elaborate shopping trips funded by money supposedly raised for charity events. There were photos of her wearing expensive jewelry and designer clothes while claiming poverty when asked to contribute to actual charitable causes. "My sister Madison has been running a separate scam," I continued, my voice somehow carrying over the chaos. "She's been collecting donations for various children's charities through her social media platforms, then spending the money on herself." Madison was sobbing now, her perfect makeup running down her cheeks as photographers captured every moment. The final image was a recording I had made using a tiny camera hidden in a picture frame I had forgotten at the house during a brief visit in January. It showed Richard and Thomas Whitmore discussing their plan to force out the Riverside residents, including specific mentions of bribes, intimidation tactics, and fraudulent health inspections. "And here we have evidence of my father's latest business venture," I said. "Forcing elderly residents and immigrant families out of their homes through threats and corruption, all so he can build luxury condos for his wealthy friends." The recording played, capturing Richard in his own words describing elderly Mrs. Rodriguez as an old bat who needs to learn her place, and planning to have Mr. Chen's restaurant shut down on trumped-up violations. The audience listened in horrified silence as he laughed about families losing their homes. When it ended, I looked out over the room full of the city's most powerful and influential people. Judges, politicians, business leaders, society matrons, all of them staring at the Sterling family with expressions of disgust and betrayal. "I want you all to understand something," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "This wasn't about money or jealousy or family drama. This was about showing you who these people really are when the cameras aren't rolling and the donations aren't being counted." Eleanor had collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Richard stood frozen beside their table, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Madison had given up trying to leave and was huddled in a corner, surrounded by photographers and reporters. Judge Holbrook stood and began walking toward the stage. Other guests followed her lead, rising from their tables in a show of support. She took the microphone gently from my hands and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of years on the bench, "I think we've all seen enough evidence tonight to warrant immediate investigation into these allegations. I'll be personally ensuring that the appropriate authorities are contacted first thing Monday morning." She handed me back the microphone, and I looked out over the crowd one more time. "There's just one more thing," I said. I reached into my purse and pulled out the dog collar, the leather still glossy, the silver nameplate still gleaming. I held it up so everyone could see it. This collar was meant to remind me that I was worthless, that I would never be anything more than the family disappointment, that I should accept my place and be grateful for whatever scraps of attention I received. I looked directly at Eleanor, meeting her ice blue eyes one last time. "But you were wrong, Mother. I'm not worthless, I'm not broken, and I'm definitely not grateful." I dropped the collar on the stage, where it landed with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent room. "I hope it serves as a reminder to all of you that there are consequences for cruelty. There are consequences for treating people like they don't matter, and sometimes, the people you think are powerless are actually just waiting for the right moment to show you exactly how wrong you are." I left the stage and walked through the crowd toward the exit. Judge Holbrook fell into step beside me, as did several other guests. We didn't look back at the chaos we were leaving behind. The next morning, the story was front-page news in the Herald Tribune. "Sterling Family Scandal Rocks Charity Gala" read the headline, accompanied by a photo of Eleanor's tear-streaked face and several screenshots from the evidence I had presented. The local news stations picked it up, then the regional networks, and by evening it was trending on national social media. The legal consequences came swiftly. The district attorney's office announced a formal investigation into Richard's business practices. The IRS began auditing both Richard and Madison's finances. The Children's Haven Foundation was revealed to be exactly what I had claimed, a shell charity designed to funnel money back to its supposed donors. More importantly, the Riverside residents finally had the evidence they needed to fight back. The forced sales stopped immediately, and several families who had already been displaced filed lawsuits with the city. Mrs. Rodriguez was able to keep her house, and Mr. Chen's restaurant reopened with a clean bill of health. Eleanor was expelled from the Evergreen Hills Women's Club and resigned from every charity board she had ever served on. Her social circle, built on decades of carefully cultivated relationships, evaporated overnight. The woman who had once been the city's leading hostess became a pariah. Madison's social media empire collapsed completely. Her follower count plummeted as people realized they had been unknowingly funding her shopping habits. Several brands pulled sponsorship deals, and she found herself facing both criminal charges and multiple civil lawsuits. Richard's business empire began crumbling within weeks. Investors pulled out, contracts were canceled, and city officials who had once taken his calls refused to speak with him. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of a small house in the Riverside neighborhood, watching Chloe and Ethan play in the backyard through the window over the sink. It wasn't a mansion, wasn't filled with expensive furniture or priceless art. But it was ours, bought with the settlement money from the lawsuit I had filed against my parents for intentional infliction of emotional distress. Judge Holbrook had become an unlikely friend and mentor, helping me navigate the legal system and connecting me with victim advocacy groups. I had started working part-time for a nonprofit that helped families facing housing discrimination. The collar sat in a frame on my mantelpiece, not as a trophy but as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the things meant to break us can become the very weapons we use to fight back. A reminder that dignity isn't something that can be given or taken away by others, but something we claim for ourselves. My children were different now, too. They had seen their mother humiliated, but they had also seen her rise again. They had learned that family doesn't always mean blood, that love doesn't always come from the people who should give it freely, and that sometimes the most important lesson you can teach your children is that they never have to accept being treated as less than they are worth. Chloe came running in from the backyard, her cheeks pink from the cold spring air. "Mommy, can we have hot chocolate?" "Of course, baby," I said, pulling her into a hug. Through the window, I could see Ethan building something elaborate with sticks and leaves, his face scrunched in concentration. As I heated milk on the stove and listened to Chloe chattering about her day at school, I thought about that night at the gala. About the moment I had stood on that stage and finally told the truth. About the collar that had been meant to symbolize my worthlessness, but had instead become the catalyst for my transformation. The Sterlings had wanted to remind me of my place. Instead, they had helped me find my power. Outside, snow began to fall, light flakes drifting past the kitchen window like promise. Christmas was still months away, but when it came this year, it would be different. We would wake up in our own home, surrounded by love that was real and unconditional. We would open presents bought with money earned honestly, and we would spend the day with people who chose to be in our lives. And somewhere across town, in a mansion that felt more like a mausoleum with each passing day, 3 people would wake up to face the consequences of their choices. They would spend their Christmas counting the cost of cruelty, measuring the true price of pride, and learning that sometimes the people you throw away are the very ones who come back to take everything you thought was yours. I poured hot chocolate into 3 mugs and called my children inside. We had a life to live, and it was going to be beautiful.